morning or good afternoon to some. Welcome to today's SVDX webinar. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm Executive Director of SVDX. We are delighted to have you joining us for today's webinar on cyber issues for board directors. Per usual, this will be a 1-hour webinar in length, and we will be recording today's session, and I will be sending out that link once we have that available on our website for viewing at a later date. It's really my pleasure to introduce today's esteemed panel. I think they all bring such wonderful and unique perspectives to this issue, and so we are very pleased that they're able to join us today to share their perspectives and their insights. I will do very brief introductions to who they are, and then we can start today's webinar. With over 20 years of experience in venture capital, digital transformation, and corporate governance, Laura Druyan is a general partner at Private Liquidity Partners and a venture partner at Silicon Valley Data Capital. Laura is an award-winning business transformation leader recognized by Constellation Research and Banking Innovation, and a seasoned board director serving on the boards of CIBC Bancorp USA and Healogics. Michael Hochman is a partner in Sidley Austin's privacy and cybersecurity practice. Michael is a recognized practitioner and advises industry-leading companies in bet the company investigation, litigation, and regulatory enforcement matters. Prior to joining Sidley, Michael served 4 years in the Biden-Harris administration as Chief of Staff for the newly established White House Office of the National Cyber Director, ONCD, and as Deputy Staff Secretary and Special Advisor to the President. Before his appointment to the White House, Michael practiced commercial, corporate, and criminal litigation for 25 years in Washington, D.C., Delaware, New York, and Pennsylvania. Gilbert Lujan is a cybersecurity speaker, entrepreneur, and former FBI special agent with over 15 years of experience navigating the intersection of cyber threats, business, and operational leadership. He led complex federal cases involving nation-state actors and international cyber criminals, and brings that frontline insight to organizations seeking to improve their security posture. Through his firm, CyberVoz, he delivers engaging, practical presentations that help companies strengthen their defenses and build a culture of security from the inside out. Our moderator for today, Dan Siciliano, is a successful technology CEO, founder, and entrepreneur, and recognized expert in corporate strategy and governance. He is chair of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco and currently chairman of SVDX, board member of the Latino Corporate Directors Education Foundation, chair of the Council of Federal Home Loan Banks, and a fellow at Stanford University. Please do submit your questions throughout today's webinar. We will fold them into the conversation as best we can, but we want you to have your voice heard, so please do submit your questions during the 60 minutes. Dan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nancy. Very excited to have this particular panel. As you know, anything to do with cyber security always has the kind of dual problem of being of high relevance, but probably people have had at least 1, 2, 3, 5 webinars or experiences in the last year on this topic. So what to do about that? And here's what we're going to do. We're going to have our panelists who are very frontline players as a practical matter, either now or in their history, give us kind of tactical current things that we think maybe are not obvious in the current discussions that go on. So I'm going to start it off by a question that I'm having all 3 of you answer, and we'll have you kind of follow up on certain elements of it. But the question is a pretty simple one, and that is, given the current landscape and the fact that probably everyone on this webinar has heard updates off and on, either from their board, their companies, or in another setting, about what the state of affairs is for cybersecurity. What would you say is your summary of the key points that a sitting director needs to keep very much front of mind about the current environment in cybersecurity for purposes of medium and large corporations, probably publicly traded? What would you say are the key items? I'm going to follow up a little bit on that, but I'm going to have Laura go first, if that's okay. Laura, maybe give us your 1 or 2 minute. This is the landscape I think that's relevant right now, and we'll go through everybody, then I'll do some follow-ups.
I mean, I think that, at CIBC, in any case, is a large, if we were an entity that were publicly traded separate from our Canadian parent, we'd probably be a $10 to $15 billion publicly traded entity. And our official CISO sort of report is we're guarded. And I think we've been guarded for the last year, and I don't see that changing next year. As a director, in terms of, why are we guarded or what are we worried about? We obviously see an enormous rise in the sophistication by fraudsters from the outside, abetted by AI. The number of threats we've seen has gone through the roof, and the sophistication of those threats have really gone through the roof, aimed at directors actually, and aimed at employees. And so making sure that training for our employees, because phishing exercises are still the primary way people get access, is one area that directors really need to be aware of and following up on in terms of our training and our preparedness.
So you highlighted AI as a new factor that's enhancing old methods, right? So still phishing is still the primary exposure, but you've got, certain technological elements that are making it more sophisticated, more effective. I want to come back to this tension that you alluded to. I mean, you were, in a place where you were in charge of launching technology products for a long time that had lots of exposures. I want to come back to this balance between fear, preparation, innovation. So we'll put a little pin in that. I want to come back. But Michael, I wonder if you could weigh in. I mean, I'm always intrigued when someone is in a highly specialized area as a senior law partner, but they were a litigator for a long time leading up to that. So I'm going to ask some follow-up questions, but what do you think are the relevant points of the current landscape that you think stand out to you and people need to be most attentive to?
Sure, and thanks for including me, and hello to everybody out there, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening. So I think one overarching concept, and Lara did a very good job addressing this, but is that this is a constantly evolving landscape. And that is not only in terms of the threat actors that are out there and the inclusion of artificial intelligence to make much more sophisticated, whether it's espionage or financial crimes, the risks are escalating, and boards, no matter how well prepared they may have been in the past, it's a constant evolution to that effect. And to make that sort of a layered complication, the cybersecurity and AI related regulation that is out there at the federal level and at the state level and at the international level is also very complicated and patchwork. And so there are many regulatory compliance obligations, even though there's no federal overarching piece of legislation, at least not yet, with respect to AI and the utilization of AI, both internally and also externally facing with bad actors. Boards need to be prepared. And that is not only talking internally, but also meeting with experts from outside the organization and outside counsel to make sure that they are prepared, and also to fend off proactively the possibility of litigation, whether it be a derivative action against the company or class action litigation. Those kinds of details matter. And so it's incumbent on a board to be well prepared, involving things like tabletop exercises and a frequent informational updates, both internally and externally.
I'm going to come back around to the kind of board practical steps and the things they have to be aware of in a few minutes. But Gilbert, I'm going to ask you the same question about your view of the landscape, but then forewarning you, I'm probably going to ask you for some examples because you're kind of the one maybe a little bit more tactically on the ground for us. But what would be your answer to what's the most relevant points of concern in the current landscape? And then I'll do the follow-up.
Yeah, I would definitely describe the landscape as evolving, and I think Laura and Michael kind of alluded to that. It's evolving, and with AI is a good example of that, right? It's definitely showing how these actors are evolving and using what's new at their fingertips to attack in different ways. But even though it's evolving, I take a step back and still say that at the end of the day, communication still reigns king, right? I follow a certain source, and this is something I'll share later on. I know we'll provide just, I guess, suggestions of what people can look into for additional information. But I came across an interesting survey that mentioned that there are almost 500 executives, cybersecurity executives were polled, and they were about 70% of them said that misalignment was probably the biggest issue during a cyber attack, rather than more so than the actual attack itself. And so that was very interesting to see. So although the landscape of cybersecurity is always evolving, I think at the end of the day, there's certain foundations that just seem to persist throughout it all. And we can't forget that, right?
And that's good news and bad news, right? So
Right.
the rate of change continues to increase, but the good news is that the foundational issues are at least, if not the same, very similar. So maybe give us an example, Gilbert, of what that alignment issue was, or can be. Maybe just an illustration of, you know, what might be playing out. You've got a cybersecurity incident, ransomware, otherwise, and then
Right.
there you are tackling it, and you have an alignment issue. What's that mean? What's that look like?
Yeah, in my experience dealing with companies in the middle of attacks, right? There were cases where we were getting two types of information from the same source, and so I think much of that misalignment comes from, and I think we'll touch on this later on, but it comes from unclear authority, right? Who's doing what at the time? It might come from unrehearsed scenarios. We may be touching on the tabletops, as Michael mentioned as well, and so it's those little things. It's almost like a sports team. I'm a big sports guy, right? And so you can't get it right without practice. And so, I was on the other end investigating certain cases where, unfortunately, the information coming from that victim wasn't they weren't on the same page, right? And so that makes things really hard trying to figure out, okay, what should we rely on and what shouldn't we rely on?
So we're going to come back to that for sure, because I think you're highlighting the need to pre-identify and have philosophical, if not tactical, answers at the board level, management level, around everything from do or don't we pay ransomware? What's our effect? Do we cooperate with the other? There's a bunch of questions that in real time are probably pretty hard to sort through, because these are high stakes, time pressured scenarios. Okay, we'll come to the tactics of that. Let me ask a question for any three of you, though I will, if no one raises their hand, I'll call on Laura. What is the most different part of your answer when you describe the landscape now compared to, say, a year or two ago? Like the thing that you say, that if I go back in time and ask you the same question, I played it for you right now, we would say, oh my gosh, look, and we'd highlight something that's very different. What is the most different thing you think, Laura, or Michael or Gilbert, over the last 2 years? So 2 years ago, your answer versus your answer now.
I think for me, just because it happened on a company or whose board I was on, is really around third party risk. I mean, we talked about it in our session, but the two places that companies are most likely to get breached are around M&A and the lack of urgency. And I think that companies often have in harmonizing their IT environments post M&A. And second is third party risk. And that I was on the board of a company where we had a vendor we had a long established relationship with, was acquired for several $100 million by a public company that had smallish public company, has a generic enough name, but if you Googled the public company, it turns out it was a state-owned enterprise by a large Chinese company, or sorry, by a large Chinese company, and this went undetected because nobody at the company had tracked this, and that was a shock. And so even doing something as basic as tracking, if you've got vendors and they're getting acquired, that's probably something that your general counsel, procurement, whoever you want to task with, it should be tracking, right? Because third party risk is an area that companies, I think, really struggle with, large and small, and certainly public companies. And that's the place where you really do run the most, that in M&A are the places you're most likely to get a breach. Plenty of them have been in the news, whether it's SolarWinds or more obviously tons of things recently. We get notices all the time at CIBC. I'm sure other directors who are listening to this have gotten notices from vendors. But there are some, and it's hard to protect yourself from all of them, but some of them are kind of unforced errors. And I think those are things, there are some hygienic things we can all do as directors that you can probably do a better job of. That would be one thing that was a learning for me in this last year.
Wow. And you've just checked three big boxes. So you have nation state actor implicated in this issue. You have, the exposure, the depth of non-obvious exposure from these third parties, right? And that intersects with the idea of either infrastructure, supply chain, logistics support, like these things that companies rely on as a regular course. So it implies, it seems to me, a much wider scope of attentiveness required by a company that's engaging diligently, right? And that's a tall order. I want to come back to that in terms of like, because our next question is kind of board responsibility. What's the board really
Sure,
supposed to
of
do here?
course.
So we'll put a pin in that, but I want to give Gilbert and Michael the opportunity, no obligation, to expand on anything. If anything jumps to mind that, boy, Dan, this is really different this year than say I would have said something similar last year. Gilbert, you unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would definitely point out social engineering aspect of things. That's definitely evolved from my experience looking at the investigations that I was involved in. Social engineering has really taken a jump from these actors hiding behind that screen and they're remaining somewhat anonymous as far as not picking up that phone and doing those traditional type of things. Now with AI coming on to the scene, it's easy to imitate voices. It's easy to do those sorts of things, and now they have that at their fingertips. And I think social engineering is taking on a whole new aspect. And in cases I've seen, those C-suite executives, those board members, those people at those high-level positions. Are being targeted because they have that authority in many cases to make that call and say, well, to someone below them saying, I need this done. Please do this. It's urgent. And as we all know, these attacks, urgency is key, right? And so direction coming from a person at that level is usually just followed. And so these new tools are adding a whole new aspect to these attacks.
Gilbert, so it's both interesting and scary that you say the social engineering thing is the thing that's looming even larger for you, because my impression has always been that social engineering was the purview of the most skilled cyber attackers. And like that social engineering has for a long time been, I don't know if it's number one, but maybe number one or two or three of the effective tools perpetrated against victims, right? And so the fact that it's elevated even more is a little bit terrifying. We'll come back to maybe some steps that people can take to continue to batten down the hatches. But Michael, if you want to contribute at all, otherwise I'm going to switch to the board responsibilities questions. Go ahead.
Sure, although it's a tough to follow Lara and Gilbert. They do a great job as the opening acts for this. But two things. One is the sophistication of these attacks, and that was already gone into in some depth, so I won't belabor that point. But also the notion of living off the land is something that's become more prevalent, where bad actors, nation state threat actors are burrowing into companies' systems and laying low for extended periods of time. That's a relatively new phenomenon that we're reading about in the public publications. And then one other thing is the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015. And without going too far into the weeds, that was a piece of legislation that created a legal framework to encourage voluntary and timely sharing of cyber threat information from the private sector with the federal government, intelligence community, and law enforcement. That law sunset in September. Not only is that not active right now, although there's a movement to try to reauthorize that, and that may happen when Congress goes back into session and we get through some things that we're dealing with as a nation right now. But it provides liability protections for companies, and it was a very effective tool. And I think, like I said, I mean, there are differing opinions on this, but there seems to be a movement, and certainly the White House National Cyber Director has been very public lately about wanting to have a reauthorization of that piece of legislation.
Great. We got a couple of questions, which I'll make sure I just clarify, and then we'll move to this kind of board role. So one of the questions was for Gilbert, but I think I followed up and you defined it, which was define misalignment. And misalignment is the tension that arises oftentimes in real time when you have lack of pre-engineered agreement on critical issues, whether it's, for example, let's tie it into something Michael just said, and correct me or expand on this if I get either of these wrong, but Michael, you highlighted living off the land and embedded folks who kind of lie low and wait for the right moment or monitor. And so oftentimes when that's discovered, there is sometimes a presentation or a suggestion to the management or board that says, listen, we got to fix this, but we got to take everything down and we got to do it in 5 minutes. It's going to be down for 20 hours. And that's a really tough call, depending on what kind of industry you're in. And some will say, to hell with that. There's no way we're going down with no notice for more than 10 minutes. And others will say, but we have to. And so you get this crisis of misalignment where you've got this imminent threat. No one ever talked about what's the criteria for taking your systems down, depriving your customers of very critical real-time resources, blowing your contracts with folks, et cetera. So that's a classic misalignment where no one knows quite what to do. The social engineer. So I hope, is that about right? Like, I will not say I speak directly from experience, but let's say I'm saying it for a friend. But if that made sense, I see you nodding, Gilbert. That's like a kind of a classic one. Okay. The social engineering, again, a question of definition. Social engineering has been around way before cybersecurity issues were around, but it is, in short, the use of human interaction to penetrate or circumvent other systems that are established or designed, technological or otherwise, to secure systems. So social engineering was tricking the guard into loaning you his key so you could steal the jewels from the museum. That's social engineering. But social engineering in our cybersecurity context is more about, chatting up a support person, convincing them that you're the vice president who's on a road trip and that you really, really need to reset something. And yep, you lost your cell phone and you have a borrowed one. And couldn't they send you the text to this new cell phone number? Classic social engineering creates a penetration. That's what social engineering is. So lots of versions of that. Gilbert or Michael, I don't know if you want to expand on anything about social engineering, or Laura, but then we'll move on to the other board questions. Gilbert, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that was well said. Yeah, that's exactly what it is, and it's like I said, it's taken on that extra form now with AI, but that's definitely a whole new horizon that we can cover.
Right. Okay, good. And we've got some good questions coming up, which I'll make sure we get to, but
Yeah.
let's shift gears to the very specifics of kind of board obligations and duties. So this is, as you've all said, a very rapidly evolving environment, and it is the rare, maybe the exceptionally rare director who can keep up with this if it isn't what they do every day. And even if it is part of what they do every day, they may not be able to keep up. So there's this natural tension where there's management who's going to own a lot of this. And then you have other issues ongoing where, board still has to, at a fiduciary level, supervise. So what are some key responsibilities of the board, and what are some specific things that they should or arguably shouldn't do? That's a very broad question, but I'll have you tease out. Michael, I'm gonna have you go first on this, just because I know this is your day-to-day, but then we'll have others chime in.
Sure. Thanks for that. So as a threshold matter, for example, Delaware, which is the corporate capital of the world, Delaware courts have interpreted cybersecurity monitoring and oversight as part of the director's duty of care and loyalty. And there's a seminal case from the 90s in Ray Caremark that applies here. But just as a more overarching concept, under the duty of care, directors are expected to be reasonably informed about the company's cybersecurity posture, ensure robust risk management systems are in place, and actively monitor for potential threats. It's not a day-to-day management, but it is an oversight responsibility. And relatedly, the duty of loyalty, that directors need to act in the best interest of the company and its stakeholders, which involves safeguarding sensitive data and maintaining trust. Now, the failure to prioritize cybersecurity or disclose material cyber risk could be seen as a breach of this duty. So it's incumbent on the board to stay, we talked about this already, but to be informed, to be prepared, and be nimble in the event of a cyber incursion. And not only is it to protect the company, but also to help insulate themselves from liability for these fiduciary duty responsibilities. And there's a relatively famous case out of Delaware, where one of the vice chancellors, which is the equity equivalent of a judge in Delaware, talked about how so-called Caremark claims, derivative claims against corporate directors for failure to oversee operations, have in recent years bloomed like dandelions after a warm spring rain. And in that situation, the board members were exculpated. We're not on the hook, but there is this trend and increasing sophistication of the plaintiff's bar with derivative actions and class actions to try to go after the board for failing to discharge their fiduciary duties.
So Michael, I'll ask follow-ups of others, but it's interesting. On the one hand, this feels like any other risk factor that a board needs to be attentive to, but it's a little daunting because it's expanding so quickly. Can you clarify? I think you've just said this, but I just want to be very clear about it. So 10 years ago, let's say, or 12 years ago, whether right or wrong, it would often be the case that, a panelist in this kind of panel would distinguish between companies that have a lot of information assets, that might have a lot of, technology, web exposure. They might say, in that kind of company, you need to be extra careful because you have others. And then they might say, if you're a tractor manufacturer in the Midwest and you still have a paper catalog, you just need to be aware of these. Is this idea of differentiated risk exposure across different industrial types applicable when directors think about whether or not they should be paying attention to this anymore, or has that changed?
Well, I think that there is an overarching concept of informed board members and being prepared for, the situation that is this evolving sophistication of threat actors, not only again for financial crimes, but for espionage related relations too. We've got, a lot of hostility in the world that we know who some of those bad actors are that are coming, and we talked about this before, living off the land in China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And so it really is a risk and a threat that applies across all infrastructure, and in particular critical infrastructure, which is vast. And so, regardless if it's of the industry, all board members, because everything is functioning off of a cyber backbone these days, whether it's a little company, a mom and pop on Main Street, or Wall Street. So it is really incumbent on boards of all sizes and to maintain a certain level of sophistication to be prepared for the what ifs and the who, what, when, where, and whys.
Great. Gilbert or Laura, do you want to jump in about your views of the board responsibilities and overarching? I have a couple of specific questions, but I'll let you take a stab at it. Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, look, one of the challenges in cybersecurity is it's an alphabet soup that requires different vocabulary, lots of acronyms, and I think it can be daunting for board members who aren't in technology or don't have a cybersecurity vocabulary, but it's still incumbent on the board to ask questions of the CISO, to have presentations from the CISO to understand where the company is in its cybersecurity maturity. And so bringing in the CISO at least once or twice a year to understand where its posture is critical. I think that there are directors not feeling comfortable with it, so they don't always ask enough questions. And I mentioned earlier in M&A, I think that acquisitive companies have extensive playbooks, and so how to bring people on so that they have harmonized, sales commissions, but they don't have a plan to harmonize IT, which is an enormous vulnerability. I was on the board of a very acquisitive company that got hacked through an acquisition they'd made 2 years prior to when I joined the board. It was running a firewall of a company I'd never heard of, who was the vendor. I'm like, this is nuts. And that's something that company boards often overlook. You don't ask to see the M&A playbook, and that's actually something that is really critical, because that is the first. If you talk to any CISO, that is a very easy vector for hackers to come in on. It's the job of the CISO to secure an IT infrastructure that is harmonized. So that is something that the board absolutely needs to be asking about. So those are things that I think boards don't always do, but need to be on top of, because that is one of the primary vectors.
I want to come back a little bit to board education, literacy, maybe some tabletop exercise best practices.
Sure.
But Gilbert, I wonder if you could expand on that. One of my questions to you, though, Gilbert, you don't have to answer it now if you had something else in mind, was, I know you've observed a lot of board responses in real time. I wonder if you could highlight any of the mistakes boards make sometimes in haste. But first, tell us what you're going to tell us, and then you can answer that part.
Yeah, no, going off of what Michael mentioned regarding care, I think included in that care is the communication aspect, in the sense that, so if the board is updated on something from the CISO, and the CISO says, hey, we just had a Raspberry Pi that was connected to the Ethernet port, and that Raspberry Pi used a VPN that virtualized the connection, which allowed for remote access. I mean, most people are going to be like, what did you just say?
Like, are we serving ice cream with the pie?
Yeah.
I don't understand.
Yeah, exactly.
No, yeah.
It's like, what does that mean, right? And so I think it's really important for the board, one, to ask questions, as mentioned, but two, whether it comes from the CISO, whether it comes from the CEO, whoever it comes from within the company, to have that, I call it a definite skill, a layman's language skill a person that's able to step back and slow down and say, hey, this acronym stands for this, and this is what happened, right? But still capturing those facts that are needed for the board to understand, okay, this is what happened and this is how it happened. And therefore, then it triggers questions like, okay, well, why did that happen? Should we have software that scans the network for devices that are plugged in, as an example, right? So I would say that, you know, that communication is essential to achieve that care that Michael described really well. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes good sense. I have a follow-up. We can come back to the mistakes made previously, but someone just posed a question that fits very nicely with this. So we've outlined this escalating set of, you know, things to pay attention to, kind of policy level attentiveness, questions, etc. Where should this live in the boardroom, right? There's lots of different answers. I'm curious what your opinions are. You know, some boards say, well, we've made it a subset of audit. Others say we've created a technology committee. Others have gone even further and created a cybersecurity subcommittee or committee. So what views do you have as to the appropriate board structure, whether at the committee level or otherwise, as to how to create more consistent, better attention to these matters? Laura, I'm gonna have you go first, then Michael, I'll have you go second. But I know, Laura, you have different sets of experience. So I'm curious, like, you know, compare and contrast.
Yeah, it depends on I mean, it depends partly on the board and the board size, because if you don't have a board that's big enough and you're, to have a separate cybersecurity committee, you have to have people enough also to staff it, right? At some level from an expertise and board size. A lot of bank boards and financial services companies are going to have a separate tech committee where that will live, and but more traditionally, companies will have it live in audit because it's a risk and it will live there. Or if you're a financial services firm, it might cut across both risk and audit. The challenge with that is then who really owns it, in my opinion, because I think without one real owner, it's a challenge. I was in the middle of a public company board process a few years ago, and I asked where cyber lived, and I decided not to go through the process when I was told by the board chair, oh, that's a great question. And they had tons of PII. And I was like, yeah, I think I'll really continue with this process.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Michael, what would be your answer? I'll tell you what lawyers I've consulted, the senior partners, outside counsel would say, well, whatever the answer is, Dan, make sure it's somewhere in at least one committee charter. That was kind of the slightly snarky answer, but I wonder if you have a more expansive answer that's practical for us.
I stay away from snarky. At least I try to.
As you should.
I think it's a combination. I mean, and Lara really did a good overview of this, but you know, there's a certain baseline that boards have to have, that all the board directors should have, so they're at least have an appreciation for the fundamentals. And then in terms of breaking it down into an audit committee, a disclosure committee, and maybe evenly, what we're seeing more now too are AI committees, which can thread their way into this too. So it may be a bespoke decision for a particular organization as to whether they want to have it concentrated in just one committee, but it's essential that there's that overarching education among the board, and then having some specialty committee that can focus on that. But they're cross-cutting, audit, disclosure, AI. I mean, they're really all threaded these days, but that's something that, whether it's the general counsel and the CISO are sitting down with the board, or having outside counsel come in to try to make a decision about something, help make a decision about something like that. I think there are various, it's very, very lawyerly answer. On the one hand, this, and on the other hand, that. No such thing as a one-armed lawyer.
Well, I think it's a perfectly great answer, because it feels like half of the exercise is engaging in an effort to decide where it lives and how to handle it, right? And that's probably half of the battle. And once you've done that, you're kind of more than halfway home, so long as you arrive at an actual answer. I like the fact, I think Laura might be actually about to answer this online, but I like the fact that one of our attendees is really holding us to account about our own advice, which is like, define the terms if you have an acronym. So PII, personally identifying information. It's a great question. PII is referred to both statutorily and otherwise. as
Yeah.
information that has special obligation to be protected from disclosure.
Yeah.
Depending what state you're in,
Exactly.
it's either a
Sorry about
serious
that.
matter or no, it's great. A serious matter or a very serious matter. But PII, if you have it, you should be doing some extra steps to make sure it's safe. So that's a great question.
Exactly.
Thanks for posing that. I want to come back to this board efforts and mistakes, and then we'll move on to kind of government stuff. But the two parts. One is I'd like to dig a little deeper into what boards can do to improve their knowledge, literacy, et cetera. But before that, I do want to come back, and Gilbert, I might have interrupted you, but anyone can answer it. What are some things that you've observed boards do that you think to yourself, I wish they'd done this or not done that? It can be an act or an omission that, if we're not trying to help people feel better, we would say is a mistake. Like, what are things that boards should or shouldn't do? Gilbert, you unmuted first. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would definitely say being I guess intentional, and I'm speaking specifically from when that decision is to share with law enforcement or take it to that next step, right? And so I would say really thinking through prior to sharing that information. And the reason I say this is I'll give you an example is I was in the middle of an investigation. We had identified the actors and so on. And so it was at the point where there had been 50 plus victims at this point, companies, mainly mid to large size companies in the Bay Area and other parts of the world. And a company was actively being hit by the same actor. And they reached out to us directly because they knew that we were looking into it already, and they were after any tactics, any techniques that this group was currently doing and executing. And so I'm sorry, can you still hear me? I paused for, yeah, okay, great.
You're good. No,
and so they reached out, and we automatically, they started sharing information right away. We were going back and forth on what we could share as well. But then once we got to the point that we were about to write up an affidavit for a search warrant, and that was, as some of you may know, when we write an affidavit, that may become public. That's public information in many cases, unless that case is sealed, right? And so they weren't very fond of that. And, we had an attorney to attorney call. It came down to that, trying to figure out, okay, we don't want to share. The victim was saying, we don't want to share this at all. Please don't use this in anything that you guys that could go public. Our attorney's like, well, this is going to help push our case forward, and this is a big step for us. And so there was a lot of negotiating there. And so I would say, as a board, because really, those decisions trickle down. And so be careful, be intentional, be aware of if you're ready to share, and if you are, how much you're ready to share, or what you're comfortable with sharing. I would start with that.
That's a great example, and we're going to come back to it in the next question about government and disclosures and requirements. But Michael, Laura, any observations about generically boards, responses to cybersecurity incidents or events that you wish they had done differently, or something that is a lesson learned in terms of mistakes? Michael.
Just very, very briefly. I think there can be a sense of complacency that creeps in when board members, they get their, cyber education on, once a year or twice a year, and think that that's going to carry through for the rest of the year. And the risk there is it's changing constantly. I mean, everybody on this panel has made that abundantly clear. The threat actors are becoming increasingly sophisticated. The implementation of AI is increasingly sophisticated. And that's not only for purposes of policing internally, but also with respect to products and services that companies are providing. There's an AI policy that applies to internal use, but also with the products that are going out too, and ownership of generated content. And if we just turn a blind eye and think things are going to be good, it's a status quo. It could become very very bracing very soon.
Okay, no, that's great. Laura, any final word on that?
Yeah, I think figuring out whether you're doing a tabletop exercise or what have you is essential. When the company was breached, where I was on the board and wanted to, and this is a company that was preparing to do an IPO doing $1 billion in revenue. I mean, we hadn't done one, and we're on the phone over the weekend trying to figure out, we need breach counsel. Are we hiring Mandiant? Are we hiring CrowdStrike? Are we hiring both? And, and the team was ill prepared. The board was ill prepared. And it was, it was a much bigger mess than it should have been, because I just don't think the company or the board was prepared. And that was just really unnecessary and much more costly than it should have been all the way around.
Okay, well, you're all very consistent in your theme, which is there's almost no way in which you engage in too much effort in anticipation and preparation and literacy and working ahead of time to prepare for that. But let me shift gears and go back to, actually, I'm going to insert a question that doesn't fit into our other conversation, but it's such an interesting question, although a depressing one. It was posed a little while ago by one of the panelists. It's just a one-off, and that is, should directors be discussing the threat of harvest now, decrypt later? Which is often a nation state strategy, right? So you kind of suck up all the whatever you can get, even though you can't really access it, it's encrypted, but you think to yourself, well, quantum's right around the corner. Although I would like to note that, quantum's been right around the corner, 10 years off for the last 35 years. But nonetheless, it does feel like we're getting a lot closer. So assuming you have a quantum breakthrough and you've been harvesting and you're hanging on to stuff, should boards be contemplating that as an issue? Is that something real? If so, what is the way the board should think about it? Again, to be clear for those, I know we have a wide range of experience on the panel or in the audience. This is just the idea that locked tight information that is encrypted and otherwise inaccessible still might be taken away and held in reserve until there's a moment where you have a technology tool to take a look at it. And should we be concerned about that? So I don't know if any of the three of you have thoughts on that, but I thought it was a very interesting question.
I mean, I have a little bit of experience with this with clients, and the short answer is yes. I mean, quantum is, we talked about what would you do differently 2 years ago? 2 years ago, quantum was talked about as something that was in the offing. It wasn't going to, it was scary, but it was far off. With the sophistication of AI, it's coming much sooner than we think. I mean, even when I was at the White House, it was something that, it was coming, and better get ready. And fortunately, we've got aspects of our government that are involved in trying to prepare for that, like NIST, which is part of the Department of Commerce. But no, boards need to be thinking about this now. And again, it's trying to peek around corners and be ready for the next wave, and not wait until your computers, you find out that you've got a ransomware and somebody's been sitting on your data for an extended period of time, and time's up with being able to prepare for that.
Thank you for that very disconcerting but helpful answer. Any other? Gilbert, you unmuted as well.
Yeah, I would also argue something that Michael mentioned earlier was the living off the land piece, right? I would argue that because they're living off the land, and with this data that might be encrypted or hard to reach, living off the land gives them the opportunity and the time to eventually access that information. And so if they've worked really hard to access something, you better believe they're going to take it, no matter if it's encrypted form or not. And so I think the fact that a lot of these nation state actors, they play the long game, right? And so if they ultimately end up accessing something that's hard to get, they're going to take it, right? And so whether it's in usable form or not, there's something that's going to come around eventually that'll allow them to access it.
So the punchline is that if your management says to the board, we had a breach, but they only took stuff that's totally encrypted, you don't need to worry. You actually do need to worry. Okay. All right. We'll come back to that if there's additional questions, but let me shift gears to the follow-on on the government engagement. And Gilbert, you set us up really well with a kind of a narrative about where that can be complicated for a board. I wonder if Michael and Laura, you might expand on the way in which boards might want to pre-engineer policies or philosophies around how and when to engage with the government. Are there, in your mind, bright lines where you absolutely must? I feel almost certain that there are certain environments in which you must, by regulatory or legal requirements, or where you really, really shouldn't. So I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of your views of contours. And Michael, I'll have you go first, and then Laura right after that. But tell us the ground rules here in terms of planning to engage with government?
So the first, and this is sort of the theme we've had throughout this conversation is being prepared. I mean, there is a patchwork of cyber regulation at the state and local level. There's also federal legislation and proposed legislation that makes compliance difficult. And there is a movement, at the federal level to try to make it easier for companies to avoid just having to do a compliance checklist so they can provide the products and services more easily and focus on doing that as opposed to just, checking those boxes. There's also as a thematic push, as it was in the last administration, but in this administration, it really has doubled down on the notion of public-private collaboration, and something for boards to think about in terms of engagement with the federal government. Federal government acknowledges that these cyber threats and AI enhanced risks are here, and they are overwhelming or can be overwhelming. And while the federal government has a strong posture to fend against this, it really has to be in cooperation and collaboration with the private sector and also our international partners and allies. And also, this is something that the White House has recently, again, really emphasized in public comments by the National Cyber Director.
And Michael, related to that, but it's really just its own follow-up question. Current obligations for disclosure, mainly under securities law with the SEC. Can you give us just a 1-minute rundown of what is or isn't required currently?
Yeah, well, so there's a materiality requirement. Is a cyber incident material, and that's it, the definition of material does not appear in the law with respect to the SEC. So it's incumbent on boards to consult with their general counsel, their CISO, work in close collaboration with their outside counsel and experts to make a determination as to that. And it's complicated. And the consequences are enormous, obviously at a regulatory level, but also in terms of the appearance of the company in public. Public could become a public relations nightmare on top of the obvious legal implications that can not only invite an investigation from regulatory agencies, but also, we talked about this before too, a deluge of class action lawsuits and derivative actions that could be related to a materiality or a significant incident occurring.
And my follow-up question then for you, Laura, though, feel free to expand on anything you like, is, what's your advice or what's your observation about boards that have done a good job to prepare themselves to detect, assess materiality, disclose these incidents quickly and accurately? It's obviously hand in hand with management, but the SEC disclosure requirement is at a fundamental governance level. And so what are the kind of best practices that you've observed or you think follow for boards to set themselves up to be able to do what Michael just described, which is make that tough call? It's actually quite difficult.
Yeah, I guess, being in a highly regulated industry such as CIBC, we deal with regulators and government all the time. So, for us, I think they're a partner here, and
Yeah.
I think and that's just so these are not
These are not
so
close
it's not
calls in your world. Yeah,
they're not close calls, and they can't be. And we're really transparent with our regulators, and I think we've had incidents where the regulator wants remediation done in one period of time, and I think it's great when our CISO says, "Hey, that's not possible, and here's why," right? And which I think is actually great, and he has enough credibility to be able to do that, and built up over time, and which I think is terrific. And so we've got a good relationship with our regulators, and I think being really transparent with them is terribly important. And having built up trust with them is important.
That's a good point. And it highlights something I kind of misframed the question for you, which is, each industry, regardless of, the SEC and securities requirements, may have a different set of needs, norms, and or in this case, expectations, right?
Exactly.
Their level of disclosure, and each board needs to have prepared itself to be able to meet those expectations. Before I switch to our next question, anything else to add about the right approach, preparedness, or balance in terms of engaging with the government as a cooperative partner, as someone who you reach out to for help and or disclosures? Any final comments or thoughts? Okay, and we didn't get any follow-up questions on that. So that's, oh, we did. I will ask those in a second, but let me ask this other question while we kind of frame the other that I just popped onto my screen. So one thing I like to ask, because I think this area is so overwhelming for boards, there's just so much to do and it feels like it's ever expanding. Is there anything that you think is not something boards should be either losing sleep about, wasting time on, paying attention? So it's either a misdirected fad, it's a red herring, it's a social media, lie. Like, is there something that you can say, you know what? Don't worry about this thing. In fact, I'd feel better if you never speak of it again. So is there anything that falls in that category? I hope something does, so we can just cross it off the list. Whoever wants to go first can go first. Don't all jump at once. Like a law professor. I'm going to cold call on Gilbert. So Gilbert, give us your best shot at something that we don't have to worry, at least don't have to worry at least as much about as the news would make it out to be, or advisors would say.
Unfortunately, I can't think of something specifically, but I will say this, is that I've noticed that within the cybersecurity industry, there seems to be a lot of new technology that's coming out that's cutting edge, and it's going to solve your problems, and it's going to do all these things to keep the company safe. And I think technology is evolving so fast to the point where CISA, for example, the government agency that pretty much oversees a lot of the cybersecurity in this country, they have pushed out, I guess, guidelines on how on helping private companies, particularly a lot of these quasi-government utility companies, on software, on writing software, writing code, and so on. Because I think what happens is many of these companies, because technology is moving so fast and business is moving so fast, a lot of this code or the software is being pushed out so fast that it's not being vetted properly. And so, that's a major problem. And that allows for a lot of these cyber attacks to happen, a lot of these zero-day attacks where a zero-day attack is where the company has no way to respond because they didn't know they had that vulnerability to begin with, essentially. And so I think that just the essence that business is moving so fast, technology is moving so fast, people are trying to solve all these problems. I would argue, take a step back, don't believe everything you hear, type thing, and slow down before taking that jump into something that claims to solve a lot of issues or keep you safe online.
Yeah, that was a perfectly great answer. I mean, I'm gonna make it too narrow and pithy, but it doesn't serve any purpose to treat this as other than a marathon, right? Like, there is no super sprint to solve it and you're done and you're never gonna have an issue. It is an ongoing, sort of unending process. And so I think that's, yeah. Don't be distracted by the idea that if you just work really, really hard and spend a bunch of money this quarter, it'll all be great. So I like that. Laura, Michael, what about you? What would you put out there as the red hair? Michael, go ahead.
I think Gilbert's answer is spot on, though. I mean, I don't think you can really take for granted that things are serious out there, and if you try to be Pollyannish about it, you could wind up in hot water. But just we were talking about quantum computing earlier. At one point, quantum computing might have been described by some as a red herring or something they didn't have to worry about, and here it is. It may not be immediately upon us, but it's coming. It's coming soon. And experts, including this panel, has talked about, you got to be ready, and you can't just look away from it. And so I think there's a real risk of trying to characterize something, as a red herring or a fad, because even if it seems outlandish and far-fetched, like AI was, say, 5-10 years ago, and quantum was 5-10 years ago, it's upon us. So I would be circumspect about trying to identify something black and white as a red herring or a something we should.
Got it. Laura, how
I agree.
about you?
No, I agree with that.
Well, you guys are no fun at all. I wanted to cross something big off the list, but you didn't let me. That's okay. Well, let me get to a couple of questions. Then we're going to end with our traditional question, which is, what is the one thing you would admonish, encourage, cajole people to do now that is going to make them better at executing on their duties as a director in this context? But first, we got a couple ones. One is a really hard question, and it's multi-part, but the short of it is, how do you manage the idea that anytime you're confronted with a serious critical mission data process and you say, what's it going to take to secure it? The average answer is a lot more resources than we currently expend. And at the same time, the discussion about that trade-off, the risks and rewards and the investments, is sort of a blueprint that if it goes wrong and someone does discovery on that trade-off, they're going to say, aha, you knew if you didn't spend that extra $10 million that this could happen. And here it is. So it's kind of a wrapped up, very complicated question, which I really appreciate. It deserves its own 1 hour, but maybe Michael, you could tell us, like,
That sounds like a good question for Michael.
Yeah, there is no hard problem in cybersecurity that couldn't have 10x spent on it. And there's no discussion that doesn't give breadcrumbs to the trade-off that if you get unlucky, you'll look like you made the wrong choice. What do we do as directors? What do we do about that? That is I have no idea what the answer is. That's why I'm so emphatic. So please, Michael, help us.
In a nutshell, and mindful of the time, it goes back to those duties, those fiduciary duties that we were talking about earlier, the duty of care and duty of loyalty, and how do you discharge that? And that's by being well educated in that regard, as applied to cybersecurity. And there's a certain fallback on the business judgment rule that board members are doing. They're putting in that effort. They're have a safe harbor behind the business judgment rule. But it's a very complicated analysis. And when you're weaving into it the regulatory requirements and potential disclosure requirements and the changing playing field for state, local, and federal compliance and disclosure, it's far more complicated than we can address in just the 4 minutes remaining in our seminar. But a very good question.
But you gave a real comfort here, which is, listen, the engagement on the issue in a meaningful, deep, and analytical way with professional advice and deliberation really does, from a director liability viewpoint, insulate you. Now, whether or not you get it right for the business is a more complicated issue, but I think that's actually a good answer. I have a separate question, which I would like someone to weigh in on, and it's a very practical one. And that is, how do you know management is actually ready without actually experiencing an incident, right? Like, so you can go through all sorts of exercises and people, you can do tabletop, but is there anything that you can take as either a proxy or a signal or something you can do that gives you comfort or highlights issues as to management's ability to actually deal with a material security issue in real time? Any advice? Gilbert, I see you reaching for that mute button. Any thoughts about anything to know? Maybe the answer is you can't know in advance. Gilbert, go ahead.
Yeah, right. No, I was going to say you really can't. I think I would say it's more, it might be if you're a board member and you're being briefed on, what's going on as far as cybersecurity goes, and they're touching on something that you later read, in the news that's popping up. I mean, that kind of gives you the sense, okay, they are keeping track of what's happening, what's up and coming. I would say that's probably one way to kind of get that feeling that they may be where they need to be.
Yeah. And I've been told that any resistance to answering even adjacent questions is a red flag, right? So you can't tell who's ready, but you can tell who might not be ready for sure, right? They're either resistant to certain questions or, downplay risks and so on and so forth. So, okay, well, again, I was hoping for a magical answer. There are no magical answers in space. Let's wrap up with each of you take maybe 30 or 60 seconds with our final question, which is, what is the one thing that you would encourage somebody who's paying attention to this to do or read or listen to or act on or ask in the next week? Laura, I'm going to have you go first because I think I know your answer and I really like it. So what would you?
So I guess there are two things. One,
Okay.
The number one thing I look for in a CISO is somebody who's going to give me bad news. I'd love it if they have no bad news, but in terms of a defining characteristic, that's what I want. You could say that I want that from every executive, but that's really what I want from a CISO. And if you haven't read Nicole Perlroth's excellent book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, I think every corporate director should read it.
Great answer. Note 2 years ago, our dinner speaker for Silicon Valley Directors Exchange. Gilbert, how about you? What's your thing that urge us to do?
Yeah, I think just staying informed. I think that's really big. I would suggest a person by the name of Daniel Miessler. He runs a podcast / website called Unsupervised Learning. He also offers a free newsletter. That's what I take part in, is just a free newsletter. And he highlights a lot of these cutting edge attacks, but also those attacks that aren't always covered by news outlets and that aren't really, out there in the mainstream media, but a lot of times affect quite a bit of people and affect companies directly, more times than not. And so I found his information very valuable. So again, that's Daniel Miesler, and he
And we'll
offers a free
circulate
newsletter.
something with his name. Yeah, we appreciate that. Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Michael, you get final word.
Oh boy. Well, it may be a practical consideration that I think that I have employed for myself, and I think can be very helpful for board members, which is don't be afraid to ask questions. We all have varying degrees of expertise in this area, and it's changing a lot. And just even on this call, we heard this, alphabet soup of acronyms: PII, CISA, which is Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, but also the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. And so it's complicated, and it's okay to ask those questions. And if somebody had, a little pocket glossary for a lot of this stuff, it would make it a little bit easier. But there are no bad questions.
I think that's great. And there are a couple of questions we didn't get to, but I'll make sure we forward those to the panelists in case they want to take the opportunity to answer them. And I want to thank everyone for spending an hour in what I'm sure is a very busy week for everyone. So thank you very much. And panelists, thanks for taking the time. This is great. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for including us.